Tzaharaim Tovim to everyone. Good afternoon to you, Ori. Erev Tov. In Israel, it's 7 o'clock there. It's 12 o'clock here. And through the magic of Zoom, we can all be together. We welcome both our congregations, Temple Shalom of Naples and Congregation Kol Tikva from Parkland. We're glad that our two congregations are able to come together to be able to offer this wonderful opportunity for learning for both our congregations. For those who are on the call who know Uri, you know what a treat you're in for. Those who are going to meet him for the first time, I tell you, you're going to be enthralled by his learning, his teaching, and uplifted by his spirit. I'm going to begin by introducing Uri the way I know him, and then Ariel's going to continue because we both know him in different ways. But Uri, I know Uri when he first met Aliyah to Israel with his family. His father, then Paul, became Shaul, and in the summer of 1981, how old were you then, Uri, in 1981?
I was 10. I was 10.
10 years old in 81. So I remember this 10-year-old boy standing in front of me because I happened to be on the first row at HUC in Jerusalem, and Shaul was introducing his family to us, and that's when I first met Uri at 10 years old. Of course, I was a rabbinic student. I didn't have a lot to do with him. I got to know his dad very well. His dad and I became very good friends because we both had traveled to the Soviet Union to visit Soviet Jews, and we shared a lot of stories that we had in common, and we kept up a friendship. And then, many years fast forward, Ariel?
So when I was 16, I went abroad to Israel for the, then was called the Eisendrath International Exchange. It was 4 months in Israel. We lived on a kibbutz, and Ori was my Jewish history teacher, but became much more than that. Ori is really the inspiration, in addition to my father, for my becoming a rabbi. He opened up a love for me of the land of Israel, of Judaism, of Jewish history, and we've stayed in touch all these years. So I am thrilled to now invite Ori to teach us very similar topic of what I learned many, many years ago. And I think you all are in for a really wonderful treat.
And I'll just complete the circle in that once I was leading trips to Israel, and Ori had then become a tour educator with Arts of World Travel. Ori has led a number of trips, 2 with this particular congregation with Kol Tikva that many of you know of. And so without any further ado, I'm going to say to Uri, we're so glad you're here with us, and we'll let you take it from here.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
And one more thing, just a few logistics, Ori, one moment. So I've muted everybody for the time being, just so that we don't have so much background noise. I'm going to spotlight Ori so that he'll be the main picture on your screen. If you have questions, he's going to wait till the end to answer some questions. If you have questions and you don't want to forget them, write them down, or you can even type them in the chat box. If you know how to use the chat function, you can type them there, and we'll make sure to have some time at the end for some questions.
Questions or comments?
All right, so Ori, you are
all right. Great. So it is a real pleasure being here with all of you, and you know, given this crazy reality that we're all in, it really is it's a blessing that we have this opportunity to come together, and what seems abnormal is very quickly becoming the new normal as we, you know, the particular screen I've put on my screen right now is actually the mosaic of everybody, because it allows me a chance to be with all of you and to see all of you. And that's essentially why I do what I do. I'm going to jump right into it, but before I do, I'm just going to give maybe a short overview of what we hope to do over the next 5 weeks, 6 sessions. What we hope to be able to do is to create an arch that allows us a better understanding of part of Jewish history. We're starting, as you know, 2,500 years ago at the beginning of what is known as the Second Temple period. I will not get into what happened before. Maybe I'll say 1 or 2 sentences to connect 1 or 2 dots, and then we're going to hit the ground running. And what we'll try and do each session that we meet is to go as far as we can. My goal today is to get through towards the end of the Second Temple period, perhaps the beginning of the Byzantine era, And that will open us up the opportunity for our next week to go again as far as we can. My guess is we're going to get all the way past the expulsion from Spain, perhaps even farther into emancipation. And slowly but surely, we will begin to concentrate a much heavier weighted side to the last 100 years of our story. So it's not going to be a balanced session in that we give equal amount of time for each period of time, but rather we're going to give the first few sessions will be much more of a general survey of history. And the focus then will bring us into the last 100 years that will last us, I think, will provide for us a much better understanding, especially this period of time that we're starting our session, which is, in a sense, if we talk about the modern state of Israel, we have a second frame of High Holy Days. Not the High Holy Days that we find ourselves in Tishrei in September, but the High Holy Days of what begins this evening at 8 p.m. here in Israel, and of course around the world is going to be identified, but here in Israel, the beginning of Holocaust and Heroism Memorial Day. And of course, next week, which is going to be a week from today, our Memorial Day for those fallen soldiers and those who were killed in terrorist acts, which will take us right into Independence Day. So our time together over the next month or so will provide all of us, myself included, because every time I go through this information, I am analyzing again things that I knew, but clearly I'm different. So what we're going to do is provide ourselves a much deeper understanding as to who we are as a people, first of all, as a nation for sure, and also the state of Israel. Because those three things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They're connected and they're also separate. Okay. Also, I will do my best to stop about halfway through also, just to check in to see how our questions are coming, if there's any specifics. And as Rabbi Boxman Jr. I made it clear, is that we will go ahead and make some opportunity at the end. Although, before we do end our session, I will be slowing down to a stop on our topic and focusing briefly on the beginning of our Holocaust and Heroism Memorial Day. Okay. From time to time, I'll be sharing my screen as well, and hopefully technology will be with us and not against us. The frame of the Second Temple period is one that can be started in a few places. One perhaps popular place to start is with a king by the name of King Herod, who is perhaps most famously known, because there's many things for which he is infamously known, most famously known for the Second Temple that he didn't build from scratch, but essentially renovated and restored. And that's pretty much 2,000 years ago. But truthfully, the Second Temple period will start about 500 years earlier, and that's where we're going to begin. But to understand how we got to the Second Temple period, we have to take a half a step back and understand that there's about 1,500 years of history that leads us to that point where we can return from somewhere in order to build a second temple. And that story begins with Abraham and Sarah as they're told by God to go from Haran, from Mesopotamia, to the land that God will show them, which of course is the land of Canaan, to become the land of Israel. And the trials and the tribulations and the heights and the peaks and the valleys through which our people will forge on. And we've just celebrated the holiday of Passover, clearly a distinctive marker in that journey, will find us literally on peaks, or at least waiting for those on the peaks to come down with law, a journey through valleys, and ultimately coming to the land of Israel with all the wonders that it provides, and of course the challenges that faced us as well. And as the Bible describes to us, and by the way, we can be very clear that we may in this session have those who believe that the Bible, either with quotations or without, actually comes from Mount Sinai by God to Moses, to the people of Israel. And there may be some of us on this in this session that say, you know what, I think the Bible was actually written by humans over a course of 4 or 5 centuries, from around the 9th or the 8th century before the Common Era to about maybe the 4th or the 3rd century before the Common Era. Either way, we can acknowledge it's a story that describes for us the foundation of who we were as we became the people that we are. Okay, and I will start now with my first share of the evening. Okay, why is this doing this? Hold on. And just one second. Okay, I'm just going to go to show, present review, and we're going to do this. Just one second. Sorry, this is the part where it's against us. All right. Now, what you see on your screen over here is a map of the region in which I live, a map that's about 2,500 years old, or at least depicting that period of time. And the period of time is after the Babylonians will go ahead in the year 586 before the Common Era and destroy the first temple, the temple that was built by King Solomon, and will exile the Jewish people. Now, to be clear, not all of the Jews were exiled, but the middle and upper class, primarily as per was the style of conquest of the Babylonians, would be exiled throughout Babylonia to Babylon. Once we were there, the map, by the way, that you see here is actually a map that will be the same region, but the new guys in town. And the new guys in town will be the Persians. They will be very significant to our story in the year 538 before the Common Era. I'm just going to go back for one moment like this and tell you that while we are exiled in Babylon, what you see in front of you, Psalm 137, of course, if I could, I would sing it to you as per Bonnie M, or the best reggae bands that there are. But we know that by the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. This lamenting will be perhaps what was needed for a people to go through a transition that allowed us to go through those stages of mourning, when there was a recognition that we in fact were wrong. We're sorry, God, we made a mistake, we bowed down to foreign idols, and now we ask for forgiveness and please save us. Now, clearly, as you can read all the way to the end of this Psalms that I have in front of you, we know also that even in our most joyous occasions, this is the text that we recite at the weddings that we encounter, in which the glass will be broken, because even in our most joyous times, we are remembering the challenging times. Now, what happens in 538 before the Common Era? What you see now is called the Cyrus cylinder that was found at the end of the 19th century, 1879. In what was Babylon, Persia, later to become Iran and Iraq. And on it is a clear depiction of events that took place in the 6th century before the Common Era. And what we have is the depiction of King Cyrus, who is king of the Persians, again, around the time of 538 before the Common Era, on which this cylinder will depict that the great King Cyrus allows peoples to return to their homes, to their lands, to build their temples, to pray to their gods, as long as they remember who put them there. And of course, that's Cyrus. Interesting enough, if we were to flip through the Bible and make our way towards the book of Ezra, we would find early on how Ezra is quoting the great Cyrus, who claims, I am going to allow the Jewish people to return to their land. Now, clearly I'm paraphrasing, but it is very interesting that while on the cylinder that you see in front of you, there is no specific identification of the Jews or in that sense, but that's what we saw, meaning the purview that we saw, the blinders that we had were the blinders that saw our story. By the way, perhaps not that different than us understanding that there's actually no historic archaeological proof of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. However, we do know that that period of time that we identify as around 3,500 years ago is a time in which peoples as groups were leaving Egypt en masse. and there was a transition in leadership. So did it happen? Did it not happen as it's described? I'm not here to discern one way or the other at the moment, but I can tell you that as we understand history, we're looking through the lens of the Jewish people. Now, I'm going to actually come back a little bit here. I'm going to stop the share. All right. Now, as we move forward and return, when we return in stages, because it's not all smooth sailing. Just because Cyrus allows the Jewish people to return in what will be known as Shivat Zion, the return to Zion, Shivat Zion, to return to the land of Zion, it happens in a few stages. In the first wave of return, we can identify maybe 1,000 people that returned. In the second stage of return, in the days of Ezra, around 480, 90 or so before the Common Era, we know maybe about 40,000 people who return. Then there'll be a third wave. Another Jewish leader will return in the middle of the 5th century, a guy by the name of Nehemiah. However, these transitional moments of return isn't the mass of Jews who are living in Babylon. In fact, it only represents, at least in the early stages, only 10% or so say, we're going to return. We literally say, and this is in the book of Ezra, listen, we're okay. We're planted gardens already. We've built our homes. Our kids are getting married. But you guys go, good for you, good luck. Ezra and Nehemiah will later say, you don't want to come? That's okay. Send money instead. Meaning, if you remember the little J&F boxes from your earlier days, it didn't start in the 50s or the 60s, but actually 2,500 years ago. The bottom line is that our return to the land of Israel will also find our reaction to the land of Israel in stages as well. The first stage of the first wave of immigrants to return will ultimately rebuild the temple, hence the Second Temple, around the year 515 before the Common Era. The second phase will be the building of the walls around Jerusalem. Now, again, it's not always all pretty. When that leadership, Ezra the scribe, and Nehemiah the cupbearer, the Jewish cupbearer, and the king and the Persian king's court return, there'll be a very clear stance on intermarriage, on keeping Shabbat, on very strict rules and regulations. And now we can look at that period of history and say, well, tisk, 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 that's not how I would respond. Or we can place ourselves in that time and try and understand the framework through which they were seeing things in order to create a viable Jewish people, once again returning to their land, rebuilding their temple, and learning their Torah. In fact, we're told that Ezra, on the market days, Mondays and Thursdays, comes with the scroll of Torah and reads it to the people, to the men, to the women, and to the children, each so that each of them could understand. Meaning, on the one hand, perhaps very strict, on the other hand, a very pluralistic vision of who is entitled to hear the story of the Jewish people. Now, between that middle of the 5th century before the Common Era through the year 332 before the Common Era, no news is good news for the most part. Meaning no real destruction, no real challenge, again, generally speaking. And then we have the rise of the Greeks. Now we know that the Greeks are actually the Macedonians. We know that Philip, ultimately around 380 or so, 370, will come to power. He will ultimately die. His son, Alex the Great, will come to power in the year 333 before the Common Era. Alex will conquer the known world at that time in that region as we know it, and will ultimately die in the year 323 before the Common Era. Now, when he dies, he has no sons. His generals are going to duke it out amongst themselves. And when the dust settles and the last man is standing, we see that in the year 200 before the Common Era, a group of Syrian Greeks, descendants of a general by the name of Seleucid, ruling from Syria down into Judea, as it's going to be called back then, will have the upper hand. they will have defeated the Ptolemies, who are the Egyptian Greeks, again, descendants of those one of the generals of Alex the Great, Ptolemy. And in the year 200, we have the rise of a new ruling power in our region, a guy by the name of Antiochus, or Antiochus. Antiochus III will ultimately die around the year 190 or so before the Common Era. And his nephew will be a guy by the name of Antiochus IV, or Antiochus Epiphanes. Now this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes, or as he called himself, God Manifest, he ultimately will be the bad guy in a story that we all know very well, of course, the story of Hanukkah. Now let me just share something here. All right. Now what you're looking at is an excerpt from the book of Maccabees. As you know, the book of Maccabees did not make it into the canon of the Bible, but it is one of those external texts that we have. This book of Maccabees, most likely, we have Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. Maccabees 1, written originally in Hebrew, then translated, we have into Aramaic and Greek. The original Hebrew did not survive. However, we do have, not perhaps in real time being written, but there is some assessment based on the language of the text, that if the story that unfolds begins to unfold in the year 167 before the Common Era, not too long after that, this text is being written down to tell the story and the events that unfold. As you are perhaps reading the text which is in front of you, you will see that the excerpt that I've chosen is the moment where Antiochus IV has gone ahead and outlawed Judaism. We're at a time where we are now reaping, unfortunately, the aftermath of the Hellenization imposed by Alex the Great as he conquered the world. His style of conquest was to kill them through love, as it were. Meaning, you can all become citizens, you can all be part of our empire, you'll be part of the city-state called the polis, but of course you're going to have to go ahead and live in our traditions, our lifestyle. Now, the materialistic world, the world of the pagan gods, was one that was reflected, whether you were Babylonian or you were Persian or you were Greek. Okay, similar gods, different names, not too much of a problem. However, clearly, there's going to be a challenge with the Jewish people who have a different set of norms, of perhaps a different set of values. And ultimately, we're going to see challenge within the Jewish people, surprise, surprise, those who become adherents of this new way of perhaps living alongside the Joneses, in that we will be like the Greeks and we will become Hellenized. And we will even go ahead and perhaps shift our focus from the Holy Temple in Jerusalem to the gymnasium being naked there. That's what that means. In a sense, the place where Greek culture could really manifest itself. That challenge between the Hellenized Jews and those Jews who rejected Hellenism would come to a crossroads in the passage that you see in front of you. Now, the reason that the crossroads happen is because Antiochus IV will be fed up with these uppity Jews. Now, if I were to get into detail, and I was to slow down and say we don't have 6 sessions of Jewish history over the next 6 weeks, but we have 20 sessions, I would spend the whole session on talking about the annals and the history of this particular moment in time. Because the truth is that, well, there's a lot of politics involved. There's a lot of tension involved, but it comes down to dollars and cents, or to coin, as we know the name of the currency of the Greeks at the time. And we know of a rising superpower called the Romans, who are ongoing battles with the Greeks, who have been the balabatim, the house owners, the landlords, as it were, for about 150 years now. And our friend Antiochus IV needs to pay the debts of his father in conquest that happened, and therefore needs lots of money, and therefore sees no other reason other than, well, no reason at all not to take the gold and the treasures of the different temples, of the different peoples that were under his control, which includes, of course, the temple in Jerusalem, which brings to a surface the tension between those high priests who were as Hellenized as the next guy and those who said, not on our watch. And when those Jews are going to be outlawed, perhaps this is interesting that this happens on the day that we're about to commemorate the Holocaust Memorial Day. But we know that this moment in time, while Jews have been conquered before and exiled before, we've never seen a moment in time where one specific people were going to be outlawed as far as their religion on pain of death. If Jews circumcise their children, they can be killed. If they celebrate Shabbat, they will be killed. If they will be forced to bow down to idols that they don't believe in, they will be forced to partake in meals of food they don't eat. And this is the response. The response is a group of people, a family known as the Hasmoneans, who come from a city called Modi'in, which is actually where I'm speaking to you from right now. And they say, not on our watch. They're even willing to kill other Jews who are willing to follow the rules of the Greeks. Now, that's a very harsh statement to make, one which may put a damper on what we feel about the Maccabees. And yet that is the reality of the time. A small band of people rises up against the Greeks, and to make a very long story short, in the year, this begins in 167 before the Common Era. By 164 before the Common Era, Judah Hasmonean, one of the sons of Mattathias Hasmonean, nicknamed Judah Maccabee, Maccabee being the ancient Hebrew word for hammer, will go ahead and liberate Jerusalem, will go ahead and kick the Greeks out of the Holy Temple, will clean up the carcasses of the impure animals that were there, will remove the idols that are there, and will rededicate the Holy Temple. The dedication that takes place on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, around December time, will be known as Chanukah, because the word for dedication in Hebrew is Chanukah. Okay, now we're going to move along here, and we're going to see that first generation Hasmonean, that's that's Mattathias Hasmonean, great. Second generation Hasmonean, that's Judah, Jonathan, Simon, the brothers, great. It will take a while before we kick all the Greeks out. It won't be until 141 before the Common Era, that we actually gain complete independence. What you're looking at is a map of the Hasmonean dynasty that develops after that second generation Hasmonean dies. And third and fourth generation Hasmonean actually sucks, meaning absolute power, in fact, seems to corrupt absolutely, as those Hasmoneans take for themselves not only the title of ethnarch, king, but high priest, and they combine those two together, something that didn't exist before. And they begin to conquer more land than they had seen before. And in order to recreate perhaps the great dynasties of David and Solomon, in addition, they will go ahead and do something that was never done before or after these events, and that is to look at local, non-Jewish pagans living in Judea, a group of people at this point identified as Edomians, and say to them, listen, you have three choices. One is to get off our land. Two is us to kill you. And three, you convert to Judaism. Now, I don't know if there's anyone over there who perhaps knows anyone who has become a Jew by choice, but you know it's actually pretty difficult. You're actually turned away. You don't want any of this crazy. If you keep coming back, fine. Meaning, we're not one of forced conversions, and yet that's indicative perhaps of the kind of leadership that we have, and we see a downward spiral that will continue until the year 63 before the Common Era. 63 before the Common Era, we begin to see a new superpower, the one I mentioned before, the Romans, begin to rise up even more. An alliance had been created between the Romans and the Hasmoneans to ensure that the Greeks were finally and completely pushed off their pedestal. And in 63, a guy by the name of Pompey will come marching into town. And when he comes marching into town, of course, into Judea, he will look to two squabbling Hasmonean princes, a guy by the name of John Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. You can already tell the names they were given by their parents, Shlomo Zion Amalka and Alexander Jannaeus, not exactly your most Jewish-sounding names. They turn to the two squabbling princes and decide to choose the weaker of the two, John Hyrcanus II. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard of any superpower going ahead and offering to be an arbitrator between two squabbling peoples, but if you have, it's not the first time. Very soon after, the weaker of the two brothers, John Hyrcanus II, is going to be pronounced king over Judea. Well, that will symbolize the end. The end of what? The end of Jewish sovereignty. Since the days of the beginning of the Hasmoneans, about 80 years had gone by of once again a renewed Jewish independence on par with the independence of David and Solomon, and it will come to an end. It will come to an end in 63 and won't renew itself, meaning we Jews will no longer be sovereign over ourselves in our own land until the year 1948, which is a pretty long run not to be in control of your own destiny. Now, I'm going to pause here. Actually, I'm going to get out of the share mode. And I want to maybe see if rabbis, are there any questions that you can see in front of you that were asked that we should answer now, or should they be pushed?
We don't have any in the chat currently.
Great. I'm just going to keep moving. So what happens next is that while we see what's going on in Rome with the process of the various emperors, Julius Caesar, and ultimately the tension that's going to be between Mark Antony and Augustus Caesar, of course, that the Mark Antony and Augustus Caesar at one time mates, and of course they're going to, well, not be so much. We know that there's going to be a particular family that will be chosen by the Romans to be the custodians of Judea, meaning to be in charge. And the family that's chosen is going to be a family by a guy whose name was Antipater, sometimes known in some of the texts as Antipater the Idumean, but in fact, he was Jewish. Do you remember when I mentioned the forced conversions? Most of the Jews, Idumeans, chose to leave this area, to get out of Dodge, not to convert under duress. But there were those who said, what are you going to do? And in fact, Antipater was of a strata of society that was aristocracy. His grandson is going to be a guy named Herod. So in fact, Herod is going to be Jewish, with heavy emphasis on the ish. Again, not that someone who converts to Judaism is not Jewish completely. In fact, we know, and Rashi will teach us this 1,000 years from now, meaning from this period of time that we're talking about, that no Jew who converts to Judaism is anything other than a Jew. But in this particular case, not so much. Herod, at first, will be the younger brother to Fatzael. Fatzael, the older brother, will be given control over the area around Jerusalem. Herod will be given the area up in the Galilee, up north. And ultimately, in the year 37 before the Common Era, after tension between Fatzael and Herod, which ultimately brings to the death of Fatzael, Herod will become anointed king over Judea. And the Romans will say, this is our guy. Why? Because, well, he's a good king for us. Why? We like the kind of guy who is willing to change his identity under duress. And that's the kind of family he comes from. Now, as all of this is happening, we see that tension is going to be building within Judea. Tension both because the Romans outward in, and tension amongst the Jews. During all of this, Herod is going to go ahead And let me just share this for a moment. Herod is going to go ahead and, again, not build a third temple, but he's going to build up the temple in Jerusalem as he begins to renovate and restore, because Herod, being Herod, looks at the rinky-dink little temple that was there, built 500 years earlier, the second temple, and says, yeah, I can do better. And what we see there is a mass structure that essentially is a box sitting over a mountain. The mountain, or the hillside, is called Mount Moriah, a very significant mountain in the annals of Jewish history, the place where Abraham almost sacrifices Isaac. Unfortunately, he doesn't sacrifice Isaac, because if he did, well, we're not having this conversation. Ultimately, the 500-meter long wall that you see facing you and the 400-meter wall on the right side of the screen will create an area of about 250,000 square meters, a huge area. And in the center of it was to be the Holy of Holies. That is the centerpiece of Jewish identity. Now, during this time, I'm going to move ahead on my slides here. You can kind of get a sense, there's a little bit of a diagram there. The red area that you see is where the Western Wall is today. Those of you who travel to Israel remember seeing the Western Wall in person, and you may even remember, those of you who were there with me or in other scenarios, might even remember being there as well, where it says Robinson's Bridge, Robinson's Arch. Oftentimes that's a place where people will gather to hear the story and see the remnants of the supporting wall that held up the platform on which the Holy Temple once stood. But that's not even what I wanted to show you. This is what I want to show you. And what you're looking at is the tension building up amongst the Jews. That's what these four names represent. These are four groups of Jews, four sects of Jews that are developing in the Second Temple period. Herod's going to die in the year 4 before the Common Era. Ultimately, the Romans, who have gone from Mark Antony and ultimately Augustus Caesar, you're going to begin to see tension there, and the Herod Jr. will be given a chance to go ahead and be king again. That doesn't work out. Herod Jr., and ultimately the Romans will go ahead and put in place procurator after procurator after procurator, local governors like anywhere else in the Roman Empire. During that period of time, leading up to the year 66, to the Common Era, these four sects that you see on the screen, the Sadducees were the upper class. It comes from the word in Hebrew, tzdokim, tzadok, the earliest priests that was in charge of the sacrifices. The tzdokim, the Sadducees, upper class, lived in the upper city of Jerusalem, of the wealthy, saw themselves as the most Jewish Jews. And again, I'm doing them a disservice, but for simplicity's sake, for my sake, we'll go with that. Believing only in the 5 books of Moses, in the Torah, no interpretation of the law afterwards. They will be in tension with the Pharisees that you see there. And the Pharisees are the ones who are, well, they're middle and lower class. And they live in the lower city of Jerusalem. They'll be the poorer sectors of society living in the north. And Josephus Flavius, the Roman historian, tells us about 204 villages and towns in the Galilee, the smallest of which would have had Pharisees. They believe not only in the written law, the Torah, but also the oral law. And this is going to really bring them in contention with the Sadducees. They do believe, by the way, in sacrifices, but they also believe in one of the interpretations of the law that developed after, most likely, we returned from exile back in 538 before the Common Era, the synagogue, which is not a mandate from God. It's a development over time. They believed in both of those. The Essenes that you see, they were the hippies of the day. They were the ones that thought that everyone was corrupt, and they got out of Jerusalem. And they ran to the cliffs overlooking the Dead Sea and created a commune for themselves. Very strict rules and regulations of who could enter in, who could be a part of it. There was a waiting period of a year before you were allowed to be a part of a member. They saw themselves as the sons of light and everybody else as the sons of darkness. At the end of days, there would be a huge battle and the sons of light would prevail. They, by the way, and this is going to be a conversation for another day, will also be scribes, and they will be the ones who leave us what will later be discovered and identified as the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Zealots will be, as their name suggests, they were zealous for the Lord, and they will be the ones that was going to lead the rebellion against the Romans, which is going to begin in the year 66 to the Common Era. Now I'm just going to get out of share for a moment. And in the year 66 to the Common Era, tension will have built to a point where Jews will be killed in Caesarea, which is along the coast in Judea. Word of that will get to Jerusalem, and the Zealots will say, now is the time. And we fight back. Again, to make a very long story short, this rebellion will fail. It will fail, and how do we know? We know because in the year 70 to the Common Era, the temple will be destroyed again. And when it's destroyed, interesting enough, it's not the end of freedom in Judea, because 3 more years will go by before we see the end of Jews living freely in Judea, with the end of the story known as Masada. Because during that rebellion, we're going to see the dissemination of different ideologies play out. The Sadducees, they're going to disappear. They were the upper class. They were the ones living amongst the Romans in Jerusalem. You know what? They didn't survive. The Essenes, they thought they could hide out until the sons of light would prevail. They hid out all their scrolls, and they never came back. It would be a young Bedouin boy in 1947, less than a month before the United Nations declares yes to a partition plan on November 29, 1947, in which these scrolls will be discovered. The Pharisees, those very Pharisees that I mentioned before, will say about a year into the rebellion, you know what? We got to get out of here. We're not going to make it. And they smuggle their leader, a guy by the name of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, out of the city. They smuggle him out because the Zealots are at the gates, and they're saying, you're either with us or you're against us. And if you're escaping, you're against us. He gets smuggled out of the city and finds his way to Vespasian, who was the Roman general in charge of the siege. And he says, we give up. All we ask for is the city of Yavne and her wise men. Now, when this happens, the transition is going to be that those Jews who are the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai end up in a city called Yavne, and it's there southeast of the city of Jaffa that we begin to develop a Judaism which once again has to survive as it did in Babylon without a temple, without the very essence of what it meant to be Jewish. And this new Judaism, to be known as Rabbinic Judaism, will revolve around the main body of leadership called the Sanhedrin, a body of 71 leaders who will be the judges that will ultimately be the rabbinic force that drives the Jewish people forward. This will be in complete juxtaposition to the choice made by Elazar ben Yair and the other zealots who run to Masada, who say we are going to retreat in order to live, in order to fight another day. And again, I'm happy to get into it, although we won't do it right now. More likely when we get to the modern day of Zionism, to understand the essence of the story of Masada and how it will be reharnessed and revived to transform a people. But this is going to be a very different outlook on how to be a Jew. Now, I'm going to share once again my screen. I'm coming towards the end, but I do want to share a couple more things before I transition over. First questions, of course, and then transition to the Memorial Day that I mentioned. The picture that you see here, and some of you who have traveled to Rome might remember this picture. Just outside of the Colosseum, there's an arch called the Arch of Titus. After Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai meets Vespasian, Vespasian will become emperor, and his son Titus will become the general in charge of destroying the siege of Jerusalem and destroying the temple. He returns to Rome as the great victor carrying the stolen vessels from the holy Beit HaMikdash, the holy temple, which include, of course, not only the incense shovels, but also the menorah that you can see in front of you, the symbol of the Jewish people. Today, the crest, the emblem of the state of Israel. This menorah will symbolize an end of sorts. And yet, it's not the end. It's not the end because we know clearly we're having a conversation now, so something happened. Now, what you're seeing here, and as I'm speaking, you'll be able to read through some of these decrees. But the transition from the destruction of the second temple, the exile, by the way, Josephus Flavius, the Roman historian, who, by the way, didn't start his life out like that. He started his life out as Yosef ben Matityahu, a good old Jew, but that's a story for another day. Gives us perhaps the most amount of information from this period. We'll say that 1 million Jews will be murdered and die in this revolt. About 150,000 will be taken captive, but there will still be those who stay behind, no longer allowed to live in Jerusalem. They will go from the area of Yavne, where they escaped to along with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and they will shift and go up north. And as they go up north, they will make their way to several other locations like Shfar'am and Usha and Beit Sha'arim and Tzipori. And in those places, the prominence of the Sanhedrin will be felt. However, not before another Roman emperor comes to town. And the Roman emperor who comes to town is the guy you see in front of you, a guy by the name of Elia Hadrian. And Hadrian, after the Romans realized, you know what, we got to give the Jews a little bit more freedoms or they're not going to be able to pay their taxes, got fed up with those uppity Jews. And truthfully, it's not entirely clear in the chronology as we know of Jewish history what came first and about what I'm about to describe. And yet that never bothered the rabbis because they were very clear on saying there is no mukdam or mu'uchar. Chronology doesn't play a factor in Jewish history. But we do know of a story that's described in the martyrology part of the Musaf service on Yom Kippur, in which maybe not all congregations, but many will go ahead and describe the events of the aftermath of another rebellion against the Romans. And in the year 132 to the Common Era, this time around will be a unified rebellion with a spiritual leader by the name of Rabbi Akiva and a military leader by the name of Shimon Bar Kokhba. And we will hold off the Romans for 3 years because of the decrees that you see in front of you. Not that different from Antiochus IV that we spoke of. Judaism is being outlawed. And while this rebellion doesn't succeed either, and while this rebellion will find Bar Kokhba dying at a place called Beitar, ultimately the leadership, the spiritual leadership will be gathered in a place called Caesarea, the capital of the Romans in Judea. And one by one, they will be executed to cheering crowds in the hippodrome there in Caesarea. And as each one dies, it seems as if Rabbi Akiva, who is going to be the most prominent rabbi of his day, and perhaps of all days, will be told, you can end this quickly, no pain. You know what? You might even survive. All you have to do is renounce Judaism. And all you have to do is promise not to ordain any more rabbis. You know what? That's all you need to do. And he chooses not to do it. And he goes ahead. And the last words on his lips, as we remember, are Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And he dies. And as I've said more than once, I can promise you, because I say it from myself anew every single time, in Caesarea, I have no idea whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing. And yet I can tell you that there was power in that act because clearly somebody was inspired. Because if they weren't, once again, we're not having this conversation. And that there are things which are greater than us. Again, I'm not here to say whether there's worth dying for or not, but clearly for Akiva, this was a move that was intentional. What I won't be speaking of now, that we will talk about when we meet next week, is going to be a path that's going to then develop that second journey, that second tier of choice. If Masada was one choice that clearly didn't work out, at least not in the ultimate outcome, even though in the minds of the zealots who were in Masada, we know of archaeology, and I want to be clear, and I've said this to you, if you've been to Masada with me, I have no idea to tell you if the stories unfolded on Masada as they're depicted by Josephus Flavius happened the way they happened or not. I can tell you what was discovered in the synagogue, and that is an excerpt from the book of Ezekiel, which is a prophet who prophesies at the end when the first temple was destroyed and we were going into exile, saying, you think you're destroyed? Maybe physically, but one day you'll be back. And we hear this in the prophecy of the dry bones. And for those zealots who are in Masada, they found strength, at least as I kind of superimpose on the story with my own sensibilities. They found strength in knowing that they were living proof that the prophecy of Ezekiel 500 years earlier came true. But for the Jews who followed Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai and the rabbinic leadership ultimately would recognize that alongside with the written law, the Torah, we needed to take the oral law that had bound us and allowed the written law to be usable over so many periods of time since its giving at Mount Sinai. We need to write down that oral law, or the hard drive that was the oral depiction of this addendum or partner to the written law could be erased, just like we saw in the destruction of the rabbinic leadership of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And therefore, that oral law would begin to be collected, organized, various topics, and ultimately in the year 200 before the common era, in a city called Sipori, up north in the lower Galilee, would be written down into something which would be known as the Mishnah. And as you can see on this page, the Mishnah is only part of the written down oral law. The written down oral law will also expand, because what happens when you take oral law and you write it down? It becomes stagnant. It can't develop. But for 200 years, between 200 and 400 before the Common Era, our rabbinic leadership will go ahead and start to argue with the page. I don't agree with what you say. I have a better idea. You know what? That's not bad. Hey, the majority of us, we are in agreement. We don't like that guy. And we'll write in the margins. And ultimately, those writings in the margins will be too much. And they will be collected into another piece that will be edited and written down in the city of Tiberias in the year 400 to the Common Era, to be known as the Gemara. And the Gemara and the Mishnah, which you can see in the center of this text, will ultimately be understood and known as the Talmud. And the Talmud will be the essence of how we Jewish people, since then, understand how we're supposed to live our lives as Jews. Now, clearly, there's much more to say. But just because there is, doesn't mean we have to. Unfortunately, we have a long time ahead of us, many weeks ahead of us to go ahead and discuss. But before I shift over and talk a little bit about Holocaust Memorial, Holocaust and Heroism Memorial Day, are there any questions?
All right, so we're going to do this sort of an old-fashioned way. So if you have a question, if you can raise it, and we'll see how many we can get to. And keep it up until I see it, because we have a few screens to scroll through.
Well, actually, you know what? I can read the chats here. If they were written down in the chats, you want me to just read them from here?
I don't think there are any questions there.
Okay, great. So go ahead, whoever has a question.
Okay, so if you have a question, put your hand up in the air. Or a comment.
I have a comment.
Okay. Barry?
What?
Jerry?
How does,
Yep.
where does the era in this situation of the rise of Christianity take effect?
Excellent question. Thank you. We will, when we talk about the Byzantine era, which we're going to overlap with right now in this period of time, which will begin in the 4th century to the Common Era, when Rome goes Christian. As a precursor to that Byzantine era, I'm actually going to take a half a step back and begin to talk about the origins of Christianity. But the short answer is, just to carry you over till next week, is that the story that unfolds as the core text of Christianity, which was just celebrated last week with the holiday of Easter, is going to unfold during that period of time after Herod's death and before the Great Revolt of 66. In that when Jesus is born in the year 4 before the Common Era, he will ultimately become, by the way, a good Jew all the way through the end of his life, but ultimately the cornerstone of a faith that will develop after his death. And up until the year 325 to the Common Era, Christianity will still be a persecuted religion under the Romans. Until, of course, Constantine, the emperor in the 4th century, converts to Christianity, and ultimately with him all of Rome. So we will absolutely get into that development when we begin next week's session.
Thank you. We do have one in the chat. Karen Roberts said, I need an affirmation that the Jewish people and money built the Colosseum.
You need confirmation of Jewish people built the Colosseum. The Colosseum, as far as I remember, is built around 90 or 95 or so to the Common Era. And it makes sense that Jews would be involved in that construction because, as I mentioned, I don't mention too much numbers or demographics because truthfully, we don't have accurate sources and there's a discrepancy back and forth. But if we went with Josephus Flavius, we would know there was at least 100,000 slaves that were taken in the aftermath of the Great Revolt. And those, of course, would be going back to, be brought back to Rome. Whether or not Jewish money was involved, that's a little harder for me to say, but again, slaves most likely would have been involved in the construction.
Excellent, thanks, Ari. So let's wrap it up with a little bit of a talk about what we're gonna be experiencing now.
Okay. I'm gonna once again share my screen so you can see this. Okay. As I'm speaking, you can go ahead and read this poem that was written by Chaim Guri. Chaim Guri, born in the Mandate Palestine. As you know, Palestine was the name of this land before the state of Israel. It was called Palestine, by the way, because in the aftermath of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, as punishment to the Jews, we know that Hadrian, the emperor, will go ahead and do a few things. One, he will go ahead and change the name of Jerusalem to Ilia Capitolina, naming him after himself, Ilia and Capitolina, the altar to Jupiter. He will also take what was a regional name for Greater Syria and give a posthumous victory to the biblical arch enemies of the Jews, the Philistines, and call Judea specifically Palestina or Palestine. So that's where the name comes from. And again, as we get into modern history, we can refer back to that. But Guri is born in Mandate, Palestine, 1923, will become, after studying agriculture up north, will become a fighter in the Palmach in 1941, the crack commando unit of the Haganah. And I know that I'm saying terms yet that we haven't spoken of, but this is the precursor to the IDF. He'll be a platoon commander, and later studying literature, will become the poet laureate of the Jewish people in the land of Israel and the state of Israel, alongside a few other poet laureates, but he definitely is a poet of this era. And the poem that you're reading here is a poem that he writes actually later in life, referring back to this period of time and the aftermath of the Holocaust, because he saw with his own eyes, as part of his role during the Palmach days before the state is founded and the War of Independence, his job in 1946 will be to go back to Europe and help smuggle Jews in under the noses of the British, the remnant, those Jews who survived the Holocaust. And as you're reading this, you perhaps can jump right into the analogy that he's making to the binding of Isaac. And the binding of Isaac, which of course was that seminal moment, that pivotal, transitional moment that I referred to earlier on Mount Moriah. He's going to go ahead, and without me now reading the entire poem, which is very powerful, he makes a very painful statement at the end, in which he writes, "But he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts." This is a painful statement, and he, in his mind, perhaps, is seeing what happened in the Holocaust. He's seeing as one generation wasn't able to help the next generation. A parent wasn't able to help their child. And he carries that knife with him. Are we in fact destined to this? And I want to be very specific of the time that he is writing about, because the young state of Israel, a state which we will get to later on in our seminar, is one that, on the one hand, miracle of miracles, is able to rise out of the ashes and to fight off all the Arab armies who, moments after we declare ourselves a state on May 14th, 1948, unified attack Israel. And we hold them off, and we aren't annihilated. So the young new Jew, and I say new Jew because in their own minds, that's how they saw themselves, as the antithesis to the old Jew, the one who hid in the corners in Europe, in the 19th century pogroms, and even in the Holocaust. They will say to those young Jews those Jews who are arriving, the remnants who survived, "Come, brothers and sisters, this is your home, but do me a favor. Please, why don't you be more like us, strong like us? Tell me something. Why did you hide in the corners? Why didn't you fight back? Because if you fought back, at least, while you may be dead, like Mordechai Analevich and the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, at least you would have died with pride." Now, this is a painful statement to make, a terrible one about Holocaust survivors. And yet that was the reality as perceived by those young Israelis who, against all odds, held off what they perceived to be a Holocaust of their own. How could they have possibly imagined? How could they have possibly imagined what happened in the Holocaust? Now, I say that because if you take a look for a second at the last slide I wanted to show you, you see two terms here. And these two terms are reflective, on the one hand, of a transition that we in the state of Israel will go through as we begin to mature and recognize that we can take a deep breath and look around us and in fact understand that there is more than one way to be a hero. And we'll get into that as we talk about the modern state. But both of these concepts, on the one hand, Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of God's name, in which we are willing to die for a greater cause, is in fact, as Mordechai Analevich, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, lived his life and writes about it in a letter that he wrote during the rebellion, which, by the way, today is the anniversary of the beginning of the Warsaw Ghetto, April 19th. And Kiddush HaChaim, The sanctification of life, on the one hand, will be that evolution that I alluded to of where we got to around the 70s, in which we understand that, in fact, more than one way to be a hero, and that giving a hand to a child, knowing you're going to your death, but giving strength to that child is heroic. Lining up because maybe you're being told, fine, maybe I'll get out of this, is heroic. Both of these, both Kiddush HaChaim, the sanctification of life, and the sanctification of God's name, were prominent concepts already during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. Meaning, heroism was plentiful and abound in the Holocaust. And I say that because today, which is began 10 minutes ago, the beginning of Holocaust Memorial Day is in fact Holocaust and Heroism Memorial Day. And this notion of heroism, I think, is so important to recognize that if perhaps when the day was established in the founding of the State of Israel, there was only one perception of what that heroism is, here in the State of Israel, we recognize today, as we evolve, as we learn how to remember, because we do communal memory better than anyone else. We just celebrated Passover. We can tell you why we left Egypt 3,500 years ago. It was the personal memory we were less interested in, and yet we have developed, I think, to a place where we can completely and utterly understand that we can embrace all responses to what happened in the Holocaust, and that it took real heroism on both ends. And having said all that, while language is oftentimes a bridge to understanding, unless we were there, language is nothing other than a barrier to understanding. Now, whether or not we are born with a knife in our hearts, are we destined to this kind of slaughter? I would challenge Guri, and I think truthfully, knowing Guri's writing, he challenges himself into understanding that perhaps this bequeathing of one generation to the next of the knife in our hearts is actually on par with the bequeathing of one generation to the next, to be able to take a deep breath, to stand up and to say, I will not die today. And that we have the ability to rise up again and again and again. I will take this off for a moment, and we're back to seeing everybody. And that's session number 1.
Kol hakavod, am I on? Kol hakavod, Uri Rabah, on behalf of all of us. A couple of just comments I want to make about how inspiring and how thank you for connecting all of that in such a beautiful way with where we are today with Yom HaShoah v'Hagvorah, as you said, the day of Holocaust remembrance and resistance. So on that note, I want to remind my congregation, I know Ariel's congregation had their Yom HaShoah observance yesterday. Our congregation will have ours tonight at 7 p.m. Please tune in as the cantor and I do a service of remembrance for tonight at Yom HaShoah, 7 o'clock online, of course. Also want to make a pitch that if you're inspired with all these events about Israel, some have been to Israel before, some have not. Rabbi Boxman, Ariel's congregation will be leading a trip in December, please God. It's, next December we're talking about.
With Rabbi Miller will be leading that trip to Israel, and if still interested, I believe there's still spots available.
And from Kol Tikva, we'll have our next 2 trips back to back in June of 21. So a year from this June will be 1 trip for first timers and a trip for those who have been to Israel before, a much more nuanced, layered trip, places you've never been before. It's not the typical Masada and Dead Sea trip. It's going to be something altogether different. And with any luck at all, maybe we'll have Uri be able to lead the trip too. So Just putting that out there for those that might be thinking about their next trip to Israel. Anything else, Ariel?
I think that's it. We'll look forward to seeing everybody back next week, same time, Monday at noon. And
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
One last thing.
Yeah.
I didn't get a chance before, but I hope and I pray that you are safe and healthy in this reality that we find ourselves in. On the one hand, we are sharing this screen, but we're clearly sharing a reality that is something that we have never encountered before. And we pray that we find ourselves surrounded by loved ones, because when everything is said and done, it's that connection with each other, whether it's in person or if we can't be with each other physically, it's on the other end of a screen. So let's find strength wherever we can find it.
Thank you, Ori, and it gives us a
Bye,
chance to
everyone.
connect. It gives us a chance to connect with our brothers and sisters in Israel through you. So the magic of this medium allows us to get one Jewish family connected across the seas. Toda rabba, everybody, and we'll hopefully see you tonight and see you next week.
Bye, everyone.
bye, everybody.